Traffic was at a standstill. Horns blared, engines rumbled, and frustration filled the air like a thick cloud. Among the endless line of cars, a sudden commotion broke out. The kind that makes heads turn, whispers spread, and phones come out to record. A police officer, with his jaw clenched and his eyes burning with anger, had stopped a car, cutting off all routes of escape. He stood tall, aggressive, and intimidating, with his hand resting dangerously on his belt, right above his holstered weapon. The car's driver, a black man, sat in silence, his face calm but his hands tightening around the steering wheel. As he slowly rolled down the window, the officer's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Step out of the car. Now." There was no reason given, no explanation. Just a demand. And when the driver hesitated for even a moment, trying to understand why he was being pulled over, the officer's patience snapped. "What? You got a problem hearing orders? Or is it just that you think you're above them?" The officer leaned in, his tone dripping with a kind of disdain that could only be described as practiced. "I said, get out." Reluctantly, the man opened his door and stepped out, raising his hands slightly, not in surrender, but in a gesture of compliance. He stood there, quietly, waiting, while eyes from every car around them watched. "License and registration," the officer demanded, but it was clear this wasn't about paperwork. It was about something deeper, something ugly and festering. "Why did you pull me over?" the man asked, his voice calm but firm. It wasn't the voice of someone guilty or afraid, but it was the voice of someone tired of this kind of treatment, tired of the constant need to prove himself innocent before even being accused of a crime. The officer's lips curled into a sneer. "You people always have an attitude, don't you?" he spat, stepping closer, invading the man's space, hoping to provoke him. "This is my street. My rules. And you don't get to question that." Without warning, the officer shoved the man hard against the car, pressing him there, as if to show his control over the situation, his dominance. "Hands behind your back," he said, yanking out a pair of cuffs. And when the man, still trying to process this injustice, didn't respond quickly enough, the officer struck. A fist flew, landing squarely on the side of the man's face. Gasps echoed from the surrounding vehicles, but nobody moved, nobody interfered. Some filmed, some whispered, but the collective silence was deafening. "Resisting arrest, huh?" the officer taunted, his voice loud enough to echo across the street. "Thought you could get away with whatever you want?" The man looked up, his cheek reddening, but his eyes were still steady, clear, and piercing. There was no rage in them, no fear. Just a quiet, unyielding strength. "I'm not resisting," he said calmly. "And I'm not just anybody." The officer's eyes narrowed, sensing a challenge but not understanding it yet. "Oh, I know who you are," he lied, dismissively. "You're just another punk who thinks he's too smart to follow the law. But guess what? I make the rules here." The man's eyes glinted, and for the first time, he spoke words that made the officer falter, even if just for a moment. "You have no idea who you're talking to." And that's when it all began to unravel. It was supposed to be just another traffic stop, a simple moment for the officer to assert his authority. But when the man quietly reached into his jacket, careful, slow, deliberate, and pulled out a badge, the officer's face blanched. It was a badge that meant more than just a title, it was a symbol of power that far surpassed his own. "I'm a federal agent," the man said, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the entire street. The badge gleamed, unmistakable, and the officer froze, his arrogance crumbling, replaced by a sudden, creeping realization. An agent of the FBI. In that instant, everything changed. The crowd watching knew they had just witnessed something that would spiral far beyond that moment. The officer's mouth opened, but no words came out. He stumbled back, his mind racing, trying to grasp how a routine display of power had turned into a nightmare. But the nightmare was just beginning. Because the FBI doesn't just let things slide, and this wasn't going to be forgotten, brushed under the rug, or ignored. When the officer tried to backpedal, stuttering out an apology, trying to frame it as a misunderstanding, the agent just stared at him, unflinching. "Is this how you treat people?" he asked, his voice low, but carrying a gravity that made the officer's apology sound even more hollow. "Is this what you think power is?" The officer wanted to run, to escape, to somehow take back every word, every action. But it was too late. The cameras were still recording, and those recordings were going to make their way to places he couldn't control. And that's how it all began to fall apart for him. As the truth about his behavior started to come to light, so did everything else. The files, the complaints that had been dismissed, the countless accusations that had been ignored, they all resurfaced. And now, standing on the side of that crowded, sunlit street, the man he had tried to humiliate was suddenly the one with all the power. But what would happen next? What consequences would follow now that the tables had turned so dramatically? Would justice finally be served, or would the officer find a way to escape the consequences of his actions once again? The story was far from over. This was only the beginning of an unraveling, a slow, inevitable descent for the officer who thought he could get away with anything. Because when you're used to being above the law, the fall is that much harder. And this time, the fall would be witnessed by everyone. Stay with us, because what happened next shocked an entire city, and no one saw it coming. Before we dive into today's story, we want to take a moment to acknowledge something important. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. We believe in equality, justice, and respect for every individual, no matter their background. If you've ever faced or witnessed racism, we want you to know that you are seen, you are heard, and you deserve better. We hope today's story serves as a powerful reminder of why it's crucial to stand up against injustice. Thank you for being here, and we invite you to join our community by subscribing to the channel. Now, sit back, relax, and get ready for an impactful and thought-provoking story. The day had started like any other for Tyrone Bennett. As he navigated his way through the crowded streets of downtown Chicago, the hum of the city felt familiar, almost comforting. Chicago was a city of contrasts, where towering glass skyscrapers stood next to old, weathered brick buildings, each street corner telling its own story. Tyrone had always been drawn to the energy of the city, the rhythm of people rushing to their destinations, the chaotic blend of traffic sounds, and the aroma of food from the countless street vendors lining the avenues. It was the heartbeat of a place that never really stopped, and he understood that well, because he, too, was always on the move. Tyrone, in his early 30s, was a man who had earned everything he had through hard work and resilience. He stood tall, with a calm but assertive demeanor, the kind that comes from years of experience. Dressed in a sharp, navy blue suit, his appearance was neat and deliberate, but he didn't wear it to impress, it was just part of the job. What few people knew, and what he never advertised, was that he was an FBI agent, a fact he had carefully kept under wraps whenever he could. For Tyrone, the suit was just as much a shield as it was a uniform. It allowed him to move through spaces without drawing unnecessary attention, to observe without being observed. He liked it that way. Today was supposed to be routine. He had planned to meet a contact in a cafe not too far from his office, then head back to finish some paperwork. Nothing unusual. But the moment he hit that traffic jam on South Wabash Avenue, he felt a sense of unease, a strange premonition that something was about to go wrong. Tyrone wasn't the type to ignore his instincts, they had kept him alive more than once. He turned down the radio and glanced around, trying to catch sight of what was causing the holdup. A few cars ahead, a police cruiser had its lights flashing, but there didn't seem to be any sign of an accident. People were craning their necks, some pointing, others pulling out their phones to record. Tyrone's curiosity got the better of him, and as the line of cars began to inch forward, he caught a glimpse of the scene. A tall, stocky police officer was standing outside his cruiser, glaring at the driver of a black sedan he had pulled over. Tyrone's pulse quickened, and not just because of the traffic. Meanwhile, Officer Ryan McConnell was already in a foul mood. He'd had a rough morning, filled with the kind of minor infractions that felt like a waste of his time. He liked order, control, and he didn't appreciate it when things, or people, disrupted that. Ryan was a veteran on the force, and he carried himself with the kind of authority that made it clear he wasn't used to being questioned. His uniform, crisply pressed, gleamed under the late morning sun, but beneath that polished surface was a man who had long believed that his badge gave him the right to be the judge, jury, and enforcer. For Ryan, authority wasn't just about upholding the law, it was about wielding power. And today, he felt like he needed to remind someone of just how much power he had. When he saw Tyrone's car ease forward in the slow-moving line, something about the sight of the black man behind the wheel rubbed him the wrong way. Maybe it was the way Tyrone seemed unbothered, or maybe it was just that Ryan had been looking for someone to make an example of. Either way, the officer made up his mind before Tyrone had even come to a full stop. "Pull over." Ryan barked, stepping in front of Tyrone's car and gesturing sharply to the curb. There was no subtlety, no explanation. Just a command. Tyrone's brow furrowed in confusion, but he complied, steering his car off to the side. He rolled down his window as Ryan approached, the officer's expression hard and unyielding. "License and registration," Ryan said, his voice low but firm, as though daring Tyrone to question him. "Sure," Tyrone replied calmly, reaching for his wallet. He knew the drill: keep your movements slow, keep your tone neutral. He'd been in situations like this before, but they never got easier. "Can I ask why you pulled me over?" he added, trying to keep his voice steady. Ryan's eyes flickered with irritation, and he leaned in closer. "Because I said so." "That's why," he snapped. "Or do you have a problem with that?" Tyrone's jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to the bait. He handed over his license and registration, hoping that would be the end of it. But Ryan wasn't done. "Step out of the car," he ordered, not even glancing at the documents in his hand. "What's this about?" Tyrone asked, his voice still calm, but with an edge that hinted at his growing frustration. It was a simple question, one that any reasonable person might ask. But to Ryan, it was a challenge. "You got a problem with following orders?" Ryan said, his tone now mocking. "You think just because you're dressed nice, I'm gonna let you slide? Get out of the car, now." Tyrone hesitated, and for a brief moment, the two men locked eyes. It was in that silent exchange that Tyrone understood exactly what this was. It wasn't about a traffic violation or even suspicion. It was about power, control, and the officer's need to assert his dominance. Tyrone's mind raced, considering his options. He could comply, make this easier, and walk away. Or he could push back, make it clear that he wasn't just going to roll over. But he also knew that things could escalate quickly if he chose the latter. With a resigned sigh, Tyrone unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out, standing tall. Ryan immediately closed the distance between them, his presence aggressive and threatening. "Turn around," he ordered. "Hands on the car." Tyrone's eyes flicked to the small crowd that had begun to gather, phones at the ready, recording every second. There was a moment of quiet, tense anticipation, and then, without warning, Ryan grabbed Tyrone's arm and twisted it behind his back. "You think you're tough?" Ryan hissed. "Let's see how tough you are in handcuffs." The scene felt surreal. Here he was, an agent who had worked to protect and serve, now on the receiving end of an unnecessary show of force. He could hear the gasps, see the shocked faces in the windows of the cars nearby. But what hit him hardest wasn't the physical pain, it was the humiliation, the complete disregard for his dignity. Tyrone gritted his teeth, but he didn't resist. "Not yet. You don't know who you're messing with," he said quietly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Ryan smirked, tightening his grip. "Oh, I know exactly who you are. You're just another guy who needs to learn his place." But as Ryan began to reach for his cuffs, something shifted. Tyrone's eyes, dark and unyielding, met Ryan's, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something, a glimmer of defiance that Ryan hadn't expected. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, and deep down, Ryan sensed it. But he was too angry, too full of himself, to care. For Tyrone, that moment of humiliation would not be forgotten. It would set off a chain of events that neither of them could control, leading to a confrontation that would expose much more than either man had anticipated. And as Ryan prepared to assert his authority, he had no idea that he was about to lose everything he thought he had control over. This was just the beginning. Tyrone sat in the back of the squad car, his wrists still stinging from the tight cuffs. The world outside blurred past, but he barely noticed. His mind was a storm, replaying every second of the confrontation, every insult, every unnecessary shove. It wasn't the first time he had experienced a situation like this, but this time felt different. There was something about the way Officer Ryan McConnell had looked at him, the way he had relished the opportunity to exert control, that made Tyrone's stomach twist with a mix of anger and disgust. As the car stopped in front of the precinct, Tyrone was led out and walked through the doors, his presence immediately attracting stares. A few officers behind the desk raised their eyebrows, exchanging confused glances. It wasn't every day that someone like Tyrone was brought in, a man dressed in a tailored suit, with an air of authority that didn't match the usual suspects. But Ryan didn't seem to care. He was riding high on his own adrenaline, fueled by the satisfaction of having put someone in their place. "Take a seat," Ryan said, pushing Tyrone down onto a metal bench. "I'll be right back." Tyrone's jaw clenched as he felt the cold metal beneath him, but he didn't respond. He had seen this scenario play out too many times, the abuse of power, the rush of authority that made some officers act like they were invincible. But Ryan was making a mistake, a big one, and he was too blind to see it. As he sat there, waiting, Tyrone's mind flashed back to all the times he had worked cases where things had gone wrong, where power had been abused. It was ironic, really. He had dedicated his life to catching criminals, ensuring justice was served, and now he found himself on the other side, treated like a common offender. But this wasn't the time to reveal who he was, not yet. He needed to let this play out, to see how far Ryan was willing to take this. It wasn't long before Ryan returned, smirking as he approached. "Looks like you've got quite a record," he said, holding up a file. Tyrone's eyes narrowed, realizing that Ryan had no idea what he was talking about. It was a bluff, a cheap attempt to intimidate. Driving without a license, resisting arrest, you name it. "You've been busy, haven't you?" Tyrone's lips twitched into a faint smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Is that so?" he said quietly, his tone measured. "Why don't you check that again?" Ryan's expression faltered for a brief moment, but he quickly recovered. "I don't need to check anything. You're in my station now, and you're gonna learn real fast how things work around here." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Nobody's coming to save you." There was a pause, a moment of stillness where Tyrone and Ryan locked eyes, and for the first time, Ryan saw something in Tyrone's gaze that made him hesitate. It wasn't fear. It was something else, a quiet, unshakable confidence. And that made Ryan uneasy, though he would never admit it. As Ryan straightened up, ready to continue his little display of power, the door to the station opened, and a woman walked in, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor. She was dressed in a crisp suit, her hair pulled back tightly, and she had the kind of presence that commanded attention. "Officer McConnell," she said, her tone curt and no nonsense. "A word, please." Ryan's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of annoyance. "I'm busy," he said, waving her off. "Can't it wait?" "It can't," she replied, her eyes flicking to Tyrone for a brief moment before returning to Ryan. "Now." Ryan huffed, but he followed her out of the room, leaving Tyrone alone on the bench. The room was quieter now, the other officers watching him with curiosity. They had seen Ryan pull stunts like this before, but none of them knew how this one would end. Tyrone could feel their eyes on him, and he took a slow, deep breath, steadying himself. He knew he had to wait for the right moment. In the hallway, Ryan's frustration boiled over. "What the hell do you want?" he snapped at the woman, who was now standing with her arms crossed, clearly unimpressed with his attitude. "I want to know what you think you're doing," she said, her tone icy. "You've just brought in someone without any probable cause, and from what I can tell, you're making a mess of things." Ryan scoffed, rolling his eyes. "He was resisting arrest," he said dismissively. "I had every right to bring him in." "Resisting arrest?" she repeated, raising an eyebrow. "From what I hear, he asked you why you pulled him over." "That's not resisting, Ryan. That's a question." Ryan's jaw tightened. "Look, I don't need a lecture on procedure, okay? I know what I'm doing." "No, I don't think you do," she said sharply. "Because if you did, you'd realize that you're about to make a very big mistake. You didn't even run his ID, did you?" Ryan's face flushed with anger. "I don't need to." "Yes, you do," she interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "Because I just did. And you're not going to like what I found." Back in the station, Tyrone could hear the muffled argument through the walls. He allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. This was exactly what he had been waiting for. He wasn't in a hurry, he knew how these things worked. The more Ryan dug his own grave, the harder it would be for him to get out. The door swung open again, and Ryan stormed back in, his face dark with barely contained fury. The woman followed, her expression stern. "Remove his cuffs," she ordered. Ryan looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "What?" "No, remove." "The cuffs," she repeated, her voice hard. "Or I will." Tyrone watched as Ryan reluctantly reached down, fumbling with the key. His hands shook slightly, and it didn't escape Tyrone's notice. As soon as the cuffs were off, Tyrone rubbed his wrists, the skin marked by the tight metal. He stood up slowly, stretching, and then turned to face Ryan. "You're making a mistake," Ryan said, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes darting nervously. "You don't know who you're messing with." Tyrone's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, I think I do," he said quietly. "But the question is, do you?" The woman stepped forward, handing Tyrone his badge, the one Ryan had ignored earlier. "Agent Bennett," she said, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "I apologize for this misunderstanding." For a moment, the room was silent, as if everyone was trying to process what they had just heard. And then, like a shockwave, the realization hit. Ryan's face went pale, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to form words, but nothing came out. Tyrone's badge gleamed in his hand, a symbol of everything Ryan had just tried to deny: authority, respect, power. Tyrone didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The damage was already done, and Ryan knew it. The woman who had intervened, a senior officer, turned to Ryan with a look that could have frozen fire. "We'll be having a conversation about this, Officer McConnell. You can count on that." As Tyrone began to gather his things, the other officers watched, their expressions a mix of surprise and unease. They had seen Ryan throw his weight around before, but this was different. Tyrone walked out of the station with his head held high, leaving Ryan to stand there, exposed and humiliated. But it wasn't over. The real consequences hadn't even begun to unfold. And as Ryan stood there, his mind spinning, he realized that everything was slipping out of his control. He thought he could intimidate Tyrone, make an example out of him. But now, he was the one on the edge, about to fall, and there was no one left to catch him. What was coming next was something even Ryan couldn't anticipate, and when it happened, it would change everything. The next morning, Ryan McConnell was back at the precinct, but this time, the usual swagger in his step was missing. He moved with a stiffness that hadn't been there before, his mind replaying the events of the previous day. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the cold, calculating gaze of Tyrone Bennett, no, Agent Bennett, and the feeling of powerlessness that had crept over him when he realized who he had tried to intimidate. It gnawed at him, more than the possibility of disciplinary action, more than the whispers that had already started circulating among his colleagues. He had to find a way out of this, some explanation that would make everything go away. After all, he had survived other accusations, hadn't he? He had connections, friends in the right places who knew how to smooth things over. But as he walked through the station, he could feel the weight of eyes on him, the subtle shift in how people looked at him. The whispered conversations that seemed to stop when he entered a room. Ryan clenched his fists, trying to suppress the anxiety building inside him. Around noon, Ryan was summoned to the chief's office. The message had been curt, giving him no time to prepare, and now, as he stood outside the door, he took a deep breath before knocking. "Come in," a voice called, and Ryan entered, trying to project an air of confidence. But the moment he stepped inside, he saw that there were more people in the room than he expected. The chief, of course, sitting behind his desk, but also the woman from the day before, Senior Officer Anderson, and two other men in suits who had the unmistakable aura of federal agents. Ryan's throat tightened as he recognized them, but he forced a smile. "Chief, sit down, McConnell," the chief interrupted, not bothering to look up from the file he was reading. His tone was flat, devoid of the familiarity that usually marked their interactions. Ryan's stomach sank, and he obeyed, lowering himself into the chair opposite the desk. There was a pause, a silence that stretched on just long enough to make Ryan's nerves fray. Finally, the chief closed the file and set it aside, fixing Ryan with a hard, unreadable stare. "Do you have any idea what you've done, Ryan?" Ryan opened his mouth to speak, but before he could get a word out, one of the federal agents stepped forward, setting a small device on the desk. It looked like a digital recorder, and when he pressed play, Ryan's own voice crackled through the room. "You think just because you're dressed nice, I'm gonna let you slide? Get out of the car, now." The words hit Ryan like a punch. He recognized the tone, the aggression, the arrogance. He remembered saying them, but hearing them played back to him in that cold, sterile room made his skin crawl. "You don't know who you're messing with," Tyrone's voice came next, calm, controlled, a stark contrast to Ryan's. And then, more of Ryan's taunts, more of his attempts to belittle, to provoke. When the recording ended, the room was silent, but the air felt thick, heavy with tension. Ryan's eyes darted between the faces around him, searching for some hint of what was coming next. "I can explain." "No, you can't," Anderson cut in sharply. "That recording, along with the video footage from multiple witnesses, is all the explanation we need. You abused your authority, you tried to intimidate an innocent man, and you resorted to violence when there was no justification for it." She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "And that's just the beginning." Ryan's heart pounded in his chest, but he tried to keep his voice steady. "Look, I was doing my job." "He was acting suspicious." "Suspicious?" one of the federal agents interjected, his voice dripping with incredulity. "He was sitting in his car, asking you why you pulled him over." "That's not suspicious behavior, Officer McConnell. That's a citizen exercising his rights." Ryan's mind raced, grasping for something, anything, that could turn the situation around. I didn't know he was an FBI agent," he stammered, regretting the words the moment they left his mouth. "And that's supposed to make a difference," the chief said, his voice rising slightly. "It doesn't matter who he was. What matters is that you treated him like a criminal because you thought you could get away with it. Because you wanted to get away with it." Ryan's face burned, but he forced himself to meet the chief's gaze. "I've been on this force for 15 years, he said, his voice desperate now. "I've made mistakes, but I've also put my life on the line for this city. I'm not going to let one incident ruin everything I've worked for. The chief's expression hardened, and he stood up, leaning across the desk. This isn't about one incident, Ryan. This is about a pattern of behavior that we've overlooked for far too long. There are complaints, reports that have been swept under the rug because you had friends who were willing to look the other way. But that ends today. Ryan's eyes widened, and he felt as if the ground had been ripped out from under him. What are you saying? We're reopening all of those cases, Anderson said, her tone matter-of-fact. Every complaint, every incident that was dismissed or ignored. And we're going to investigate them thoroughly. Ryan's chest felt tight, and he struggled to breathe. You can't do that, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Oh, we can, one of the agents replied, his smile thin and cold. And we will. Ryan's head spun, and he reached out, gripping the edge of the desk as if it could somehow anchor him. I have rights, he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. You can't just drag my name through the mud. Your rights haven't been violated, officer, Anderson said, her voice steady. But you've violated plenty of others. And now it's time to face the consequences. The room was silent again, but this time, it was Ryan who was at a loss for words. He had always thought of himself as untouchable, shielded by his badge and his connections. But now, it felt like those shields were crumbling, leaving him exposed, vulnerable. Just then, the door opened, and Tyrone Bennett stepped into the room. He was dressed in casual clothes, a contrast to the formal suits of the federal agents, but his presence was commanding. Ryan's breath caught in his throat as Tyrone's eyes locked onto his, the same calm, unyielding gaze he had seen yesterday. Tyrone didn't speak right away. He simply walked over to the desk, placing a file down next to the recorder. This is everything, he said, his voice low but clear. Every report, every complaint that was buried. It's all here. Ryan's eyes flickered to the file, then back to Tyrone. You set me up, he said, the accusation falling flat even as he spoke it. You wanted this to happen. Tyrone's expression didn't change. No, Officer McConnell, he replied. You did this to yourself. I'm just making sure that the truth comes out. The chief picked up the file, flipping through the pages briefly before nodding. We'll be forwarding this to the Internal Affairs Bureau. From now on, this is out of my hands. But I can tell you one thing, Ryan, your days of hiding behind that badge are over. Ryan's face twisted with rage, his hands clenching into fists. You think you're a hero? He spat at Tyrone. You think this makes you better than me? No, Tyrone said, his voice calm, almost sad. But I do think it makes me different from you. And that's enough. For a moment, Ryan wanted to lash out, to shout, to deny everything. But he knew it was useless. The evidence was there, laid out in front of him, and the people around him had already made up their minds. He was alone, and the realization of that hit him harder than any punch ever could. As Tyrone turned to leave, Ryan called out one last time, desperation lacing his voice. This isn't over, he said, his words echoing in the quiet room. You'll regret this. Tyrone paused, glancing back over his shoulder. Maybe, he said softly. But at least I'll be able to look in the mirror and not be ashamed of what I see. The door closed behind him, leaving Ryan to face the reality of what was to come. The investigation would be long, and the fallout even longer. And as the federal agents began to gather the files, ready to take them away, Ryan could feel the walls closing in, the weight of all his actions finally crashing down around him. The man who had spent his career wielding power had lost it all, and there was no one left to save him. Ryan sat in stunned silence, the room around him feeling smaller, the air heavier. The chief, Anderson, and the federal agents had all left, leaving him alone to process what had just happened. He tried to grasp at his thoughts, but they slipped through his fingers like sand. He had thought he could control the situation, intimidate his way out of it, but now he realized just how wrong he had been. Outside the chief's office, the precinct buzzed with activity, officers going about their day, some oblivious to what had just happened, others very much aware. Ryan could hear the murmur of voices, the occasional glance cast his way, and it filled him with a sickening sense of dread. They were talking about him, whispering, speculating. The news was spreading, and soon, everyone would know. He pushed himself up from the chair, his legs feeling unsteady, and walked out of the office. He needed air, space to think. But as he stepped into the hallway, he found himself face to face with Tyrone Bennett, who was leaning casually against the wall, his arms crossed, as if he had been waiting for this moment. The sight of him made Ryan's blood boil, a mix of fear and resentment. "You think you've won?" he snapped, trying to muster up the defiance that had served him so well in the past. "This little stunt of yours, you think it's going to make a difference?" Tyrone's eyes were calm, steady, and unflinching. "It's not a stunt, Ryan. It's the truth. And yes, I do think it's going to make a difference. Maybe not for you, but for the people you've hurt. For the people who were too afraid to speak up." Ryan laughed, but it was a hollow, bitter sound. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You don't know what it's like out there, dealing with people who don't respect the law, who don't respect us." "I know exactly what it's like," Tyrone replied quietly, his tone cutting through Ryan's bluster. "I've seen it from both sides. I've seen good cops trying to do their jobs, and I've seen people like you who think the badge gives them the right to do whatever they want. You don't get to hide behind it anymore." Ryan's eyes flashed with anger. "You're just another suit," he spat. "A bureaucrat who thinks he can walk in here and judge me. You have no idea what it's like to be out on the street, facing danger every day." Tyrone took a step closer, his expression serious. "You're right. I don't spend every day patrolling the streets. But I have put my life on the line for this country, and I've seen danger up close. I know what fear looks like. I know what it feels like to have to make split-second decisions. But I also know the difference between enforcing the law and abusing it." Ryan's jaw clenched, but he couldn't come up with a retort. Tyrone's words stung because they were true, and he hated the way they made him feel. Vulnerable. Exposed. "Why are you doing this?" Ryan asked, his voice low, almost pleading. "Why didn't you just let it go? You could have walked away. Nobody would have known." Tyrone's gaze softened slightly, but his resolve didn't waver. "Because it's not just about me, Ryan. It's about every person who has been humiliated, hurt, or made to feel small because of someone abusing their power. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again." Ryan felt the walls closing in again, the realization of his own actions pressing down on him. He had always thought of himself as the one in control, the one who could dictate how things went. But now, he was on the other side, and it terrified him. "Do you even care about what happens to me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you care that this could ruin my life?" Tyrone was silent for a moment, considering the question. "I don't want to see anyone's life ruined, Ryan. But I care more about the lives that have already been affected by what you've done. You had a responsibility, and you abused it. Now, you have to face the consequences." Ryan felt something inside him crack, a deep, painful fissure that threatened to swallow him whole. He had spent years building his career, his reputation, and now it was all falling apart because of one incident, one man who had refused to back down. "I've given everything to this job," he said, his voice shaking. "Everything. And that's what makes this so hard," Tyrone replied softly. "Because you could have been one of the good ones. You could have made a difference. But somewhere along the way, you lost sight of that." Ryan didn't respond. He couldn't. There was nothing left to say, nothing that would make this go away. He felt hollow, like a shell of the person he had been just a day ago. Just then, the door to the precinct opened, and two more agents walked in, carrying a folder. They approached Tyrone and handed it to him. "We've confirmed everything," one of them said. The complaints, the witness statements. Internal Affairs is already preparing the charges. Ryan's head snapped up, his eyes widening. Charges, he echoed, his voice cracking. You're charging me? The agent nodded, his expression grim. Obstruction of justice, abuse of power, falsifying reports, the list goes on. You're going to be placed on administrative leave, effective immediately, pending further investigation. The words hit Ryan like a sledgehammer, knocking the air out of his lungs. He had thought there might be a way out, some loophole he could exploit, but now, it was clear there was none. This is insane, he stammered, his voice barely audible. You can't just do this, but Tyrone cut him off, his voice firm. It's already done, Ryan. You're not untouchable. Not anymore. The agents moved to either side of Ryan, preparing to escort him out. But before they did, Tyrone took a step closer, his eyes locked on Ryan's. I'm not your enemy, he said quietly. But I won't stand by and let people like you abuse the power you were given. It's over, Ryan. Ryan wanted to fight back, to scream, to make it all stop. But he couldn't. He could feel the weight of everything crashing down, and he knew there was no escape. I'm sorry, he whispered, the words barely escaping his lips. It was the first time he had said them, and even now, they felt inadequate, hollow. Tyrone didn't respond right away. He simply watched, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, just once. Maybe you are, he said. But it's too late for apologies now. As the agents led Ryan out of the precinct, the room fell silent, the officers and staff watching in a mix of shock and discomfort. They had known Ryan for years, but they had never seen him like this, defeated, vulnerable, a man stripped of all the power he once wielded. Tyrone stood there for a moment, letting the scene sink in. He knew this wasn't a victory, not in the traditional sense. There was no joy in watching someone's life unravel, even if they deserved it. But there was justice, and that was what mattered. As he turned to leave, Anderson approached him, her expression softening. You handled that well, she said quietly. I know it couldn't have been easy. It wasn't, Tyrone admitted. But it had to be done. Anderson nodded, glancing at the door where Ryan had just been let out. What happens now? Now we make sure this doesn't happen again, Tyrone said, his voice resolute. We make sure the system does what it's supposed to do. Anderson gave him a small, approving smile. You know, when I heard what happened yesterday, I wasn't sure how this would play out. But I'm glad you were there to see it through. Tyrone returned the smile, but it was tinged with sadness. It's not over yet. There's still a lot of work to do. As he walked out of the precinct, Tyrone felt the weight of the past 24 hours settling on his shoulders. He had stood up to someone who had tried to use fear and power to control others, and he had seen it through to the end. But he also knew that this was just one battle in a much larger fight, one that wouldn't end with a single case, a single arrest. Outside, the sky was overcast, the air cool and heavy with the promise of rain. Tyrone looked up, feeling a drop hit his cheek, and he took a deep breath. For the first time since the confrontation, he felt a sense of peace, a quiet satisfaction that came from knowing he had done the right thing. But he also knew that there would be more Ryans out there, more people who would try to use their power to hurt others. And for as long as that was the case, he would keep fighting, keep pushing back. Because that was what justice meant. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning, and Tyrone was ready for whatever came next. Ryan McConnell's world unraveled quickly, faster than he ever imagined possible. The day after his suspension, the story broke wide open. Local news stations picked up on it first, reporting that a police officer was under investigation for abuse of power after an incident involving an FBI agent. The headline was incendiary, designed to grab attention, and it did. Within hours, the news had spread across social media, and by the evening, national networks had caught wind of it. For Ryan, the fallout was immediate and brutal. He had always taken comfort in the idea that his uniform would protect him, that his badge was a shield against scrutiny. But now, it felt like a target. The video of the confrontation, the audio recording of his taunts, it was all out there, replayed over and over again, dissected by anchors and analysts who didn't know him, but had plenty to say about him. He sat in his apartment, the lights dimmed, his phone buzzing incessantly with calls and messages, most of which he ignored. He had always thought of himself as strong, unshakable, but now, he felt fragile, exposed. His friends on the force, the ones he thought he could count on, were suddenly distant. Some didn't return his calls. Others offered vague words of support, but even those felt empty, like they were trying to keep a safe distance from his sinking ship. It was during one of these endless nights, when the world outside felt like it was closing in, that he received a call from his lawyer. "We need to talk," the lawyer said, his voice grim, devoid of the usual confidence Ryan had come to rely on. "It's about the charges." Ryan's pulse quickened. "What about them?" "The DA is pushing for a plea deal. They're willing to drop some of the more serious charges if you plead guilty to obstruction and abuse of power," the lawyer explained. "But there's a catch." Ryan's grip tightened around his phone. "What kind of catch?" "You'd have to publicly admit to wrongdoing, apologize, and agree to a period of probation. No jail time, but you'd lose your job, your pension, everything." The words hit Ryan like a slap in the face. He had expected consequences, but this? Admitting guilt, standing in front of cameras and confessing to everything? It was unthinkable. "No," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I won't do it." The lawyer sighed, as if he had been expecting this reaction. "Ryan, listen to me. You don't have a lot of options here. If this goes to trial, they're going to make an example out of you. The evidence is overwhelming, and the jury won't be on your side. You could be facing real prison time." Ryan's chest tightened, the room spinning around him. He had never considered the possibility of going to prison. The idea of losing everything, of being stripped of his badge, was already more than he could handle, but this was worse. He felt a wave of anger rise up, choking him. "I'm not a criminal," he said, his voice trembling. "I was doing my job." "Your job wasn't to harass people or to abuse your authority," the lawyer said, his tone hardening. "Look, you need to think this through. You've got a chance to salvage something from this, even if it's not much. But if you keep fighting, you could lose everything." Ryan didn't respond. He sat there, the phone pressed against his ear, listening as his lawyer continued to talk, but the words felt distant, muffled. He wanted to scream, to punch something, to make the world stop spinning for just a moment. How had everything gone so wrong? Meanwhile, across town, Tyrone Bennett was dealing with the aftermath in his own way. He had been commended by his superiors for how he handled the situation, praised for his restraint and professionalism. But that didn't make it easier. He had spent the past week fielding calls from journalists, giving statements, and trying to ensure that the focus remained on the issue at hand, systemic abuse of power. But for all the praise, there was an underlying frustration that gnawed at him. He had seen cases like this before, where an officer was caught, publicly shamed, and then quietly removed from the force. It was always presented as a victory, as a sign that justice was being served, but he knew better. It was a band-aid on a much deeper wound, a temporary fix that didn't address the real problem. One afternoon, as he was walking out of his office, Anderson caught up with him. "I'm glad to see you're still in one piece," she said, her tone light, but her eyes serious. "I wanted to talk to you about McConnell." Tyrone nodded, bracing himself. "What about him?" "He's considering taking a plea deal," she said, studying his reaction. "But there's a lot of pressure on the department to make a statement. They want to show that they're taking this seriously, and that means making sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." Tyrone felt a mix of relief and frustration. Good, he said. But it can't just be about him. We can't pretend like this is an isolated case. If they really want to make a statement, they need to start looking at the bigger picture. Anderson sighed, running a hand through her hair. I know. But you and I both know how this works. The department wants to clean up its image, and that means they'll focus on McConnell because he's a convenient scapegoat. It doesn't mean they're going to change the system. Tyrone's jaw tightened. He appreciated Anderson's honesty, but it didn't make the reality any easier to swallow. So what are we supposed to do? Just let them throw him under the bus and move on? Anderson hesitated, as if weighing her words carefully. I don't think it's that simple, Tyrone. McConnell made his choices, and he has to face the consequences. But if you want to push for real change, you're going to have to find a way to make people see that this is about more than just one officer. It's about accountability at every level. Tyrone thought about this for a moment, his mind turning over the possibilities. There's going to be a hearing, he said finally. If McConnell takes the plea, he'll have to make a statement. Maybe that's the opportunity we need. Anderson raised an eyebrow. You want him to be the one to expose the system? I want him to understand why this is happening, Tyrone said. I want him to see that this isn't just about punishing him. It's about making sure that what he did doesn't keep happening. And if he can't see that, then at least the public will. A few days later, Ryan found himself sitting in a small, sterile room, waiting for his lawyer. The plea deal was still on the table, but the thought of accepting it made his stomach churn. He hated the idea of standing in front of a room full of people and admitting guilt, of watching his career evaporate in an instant. But the thought of going to trial, of being dragged through the mud, was even worse. The door opened, and his lawyer stepped inside, carrying a folder. They've set the date for the hearing, he said, placing the folder on the table. If you accept the deal, you'll make your statement, and this will all be over. Ryan's mouth felt dry. What happens if I don't take it? Then you go to court, and we fight this out in front of a judge, the lawyer said, his tone matter-of-fact. But you need to understand, Ryan, the odds aren't in your favor. The evidence is strong, and the public sentiment is against you. If you lose, you could be looking at prison time. Ryan stared at the folder, his mind racing. He had always thought of himself as a survivor, someone who could find a way out of any situation. But now, he felt trapped, cornered, with no way to escape. I need to think, he said finally. You don't have much time, the lawyer replied. The hearing is set for next week. They're not going to wait forever. As the lawyer left, Ryan leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. He could still see Tyrone's face, the calm, confident way he had stood up to him, the way he had refused to back down. It infuriated him, but it also forced him to confront a truth he had been trying to avoid, that he had been wrong. Deep down, beneath all the anger and fear, he knew it. But admitting it out loud, in front of everyone, felt like an impossible task. On the day of the hearing, the room was packed. Reporters, activists, officers, and ordinary citizens filled the seats, all waiting to see how this chapter would end. Ryan sat at the front, his hands clenched into fists, his lawyer murmuring quietly beside him. He could feel the weight of every gaze, every whispered comment, and it made his skin crawl. When the judge called the room to order, Ryan stood, his legs feeling like lead. He had prepared a statement, something his lawyer had written for him, but as he looked out at the crowd, at the cameras, he felt a wave of nausea. He wanted to disappear, to escape this moment, but there was nowhere to go. Slowly, he raised the paper in his hands, his voice barely above a whisper. I made a mistake, he began, the words catching in his throat. I abused my position, and I acted in a way that was wrong. The room was silent, everyone hanging on his words. Ryan glanced up, his eyes locking with Tyrone's, who was sitting near the back, his expression unreadable. Ryan could feel the anger, the disappointment, the sense of betrayal that seemed to radiate from every corner of the room. And for the first time, he understood just how much damage he had done. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry to everyone I hurt, and I'm sorry for the way I let down the people who trusted me." As he spoke, he felt the last remnants of his pride slip away, leaving him hollow and exposed. But there was also a strange sense of relief, a weight lifting off his shoulders. Because for all the pain, all the humiliation, there was a chance, however small, that this could be a step towards something better. The courtroom was silent as Ryan finished his statement, his voice barely more than a whisper. For a moment, it felt as if time had stopped, the air thick with anticipation. Ryan stood there, his shoulders slumped, the weight of everything he had done finally bearing down on him. The judge, after a moment's pause, nodded and looked over the papers on his desk, quietly acknowledging the plea. It was over. Ryan had taken the deal. The charges would be dropped in exchange for his public admission of guilt, his resignation, and the end of his career in law enforcement. The decision marked a fall from grace that was as swift as it was complete. He would lose his badge, his pension, and any respect he once commanded. But perhaps more painful than all of that was the realization that, for the rest of his life, his name would be synonymous with abuse of power. He had thought he was untouchable, but now he saw how wrong he had been. As the room emptied, Ryan sat alone, staring at the floor, not quite sure what his next move would be. He was a man without a purpose, without direction. But there was one person who hadn't left yet. Tyrone Bennett remained seated, watching Ryan with an expression that was difficult to read. When the room was nearly empty, he got up and walked over, his footsteps echoing in the quiet space. Ryan looked up, his eyes tired and hollow. "Why are you still here?" he asked, the question barely audible. Tyrone hesitated, then spoke, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here because this isn't just about punishment. It's about accountability. It's about making sure things change." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But that change doesn't happen if people like you don't learn from this. You've lost a lot, Ryan, but it's not too late to understand why." Ryan's eyes filled with a mix of confusion and resentment. "What does it matter? My life is over. What good is it to anyone now?" Tyrone didn't flinch. "It matters because you're still here. And as long as you're still here, you have a choice. You can keep running from what you've done, or you can face it, own it, and maybe, just maybe, start to make things right." He let out a slow breath, his gaze steady. "I'm not saying it's going to be easy. But it's the only way forward." For a long moment, Ryan just sat there, staring at the man who had effectively ended his career, his life as he knew it. But there was something in Tyrone's words, a glimmer of a possibility he hadn't considered. The idea that, even now, he could do something that mattered, something that wasn't just about his own pride and power. He didn't know if he had the strength to do it, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a choice. "Why are you doing this?" Ryan asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Why give me a way out?" Tyrone's expression softened, just a little. "Because change isn't just about tearing things down. It's about building something better in its place. And maybe, if you're willing to try, you can be part of that." Ryan didn't respond, but the words stayed with him, lingering in the back of his mind as he left the courthouse. It would be a long road ahead, one he didn't know if he was ready to walk. But the choice was his, and for the first time, he understood the weight of that choice. For Tyrone Bennett, the resolution of the case was just the beginning. The attention brought to Ryan's abuses of power shone a spotlight on broader issues within the department, sparking a wave of reforms. It wasn't perfect, and there were still many challenges to overcome, but it was a start. Tyrone was promoted, not just because of how he handled the situation, but because his actions had forced the department to confront its own flaws. He had become a symbol of what it meant to stand up for justice, even when it was difficult, even when it meant facing down someone who thought they were invincible. Anderson, too, found herself in a new role. Her dedication to ensuring the investigation was thorough and impartial earned her respect from both sides. She was now in charge of a new unit focused on oversight, making sure that complaints were properly investigated, that officers were held accountable. It was a role she took seriously, knowing that real change required vigilance and integrity. For Tyrone, the victory wasn't just about holding one man accountable. It was about opening a door to a better future, where the system didn't just protect those in power, but those it was meant to serve. He had played his part, but he knew there was still work to be done. And he was ready to do it. This story, at its core, is about power and accountability. It's about what happens when someone believes they're untouchable, and how that belief can lead to actions that hurt others. Ryan McConnell thought his badge gave him the right to control, to intimidate, to act without consequence. But he learned, in the hardest way possible, that no one is above the law. Tyrone Bennett's journey wasn't just about standing up for himself. It was about standing up for everyone who has been made to feel small, who has been treated unfairly, and who has felt the weight of injustice. His courage forced a system to confront its own flaws, to start the process of change that is so desperately needed. But change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without effort. It takes people who are willing to speak up, even when it's difficult, even when it feels impossible. So what do you think? Can systems really change, or do they always find a way to protect those in power? How do we, as individuals, make sure that accountability is more than just a word, but a practice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear your stories, your experiences, your opinions. Let's keep this conversation going. And if you enjoyed this story, if you found it thought-provoking or inspiring, please consider subscribing to our channel, Tales of Twist. We're committed to bringing you stories that matter, stories that challenge, and stories that make you think. Hit the subscribe button, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Thank you for watching, and we hope to see you in the next one.